sound.
And welcome back to the Beyond Broadcast podcast, a show which takes a behind-the-scenes look at industry professionals and their lives working in the broadcasting and entertainment industry. Now today, I'm joined by journalist and international correspondent Mitch McCann. From growing up in Ashburton to reporting from New York City, Mitch has covered some of the biggest stories of our time, especially from the New Zealand perspective. From everything from the Christchurch mosque attacks and the COVID-19 pandemic to US elections and major international events. He's worked across television, radio and digital journalism, and he's built a reputation as one of New Zealand's most trusted reporters, maybe even one of my mum's favourites. And today continues to have that work as a brilliant New York-based correspondent. Now, mate, I'm so pleased I get to speak to you. It's been many years since I've actually got to see you face to face, so it's a bit of a weird one for me in that sense. But, mate, thank you so much for joining me.
Mate, thank you for having me. I'm a bit red-faced with that fantastic intro, so thank you very much, and I love what you do with the podcast. So I'm a little bit nervous being on the other side of the microphone, but it's nice to chat with you, mate.
Mate, it's a pleasure, and I think we have to start at the very beginning, and the thing that I love is the fact that we grew up only a stone's throw away from each other. You grew up in the mighty Ashburton, before ending up in reporting on some of these like massive stories, mate. Now, I have many of friends who went to, obviously, the Ash Coal and everything else in between. Ashburton is it's a bit of an interesting place, mate. It can be a bit insular, and, you know, it is its own community. So for you, what was it like growing up in Ashburton? And for you as well, was it kind of strange now, looking back at your life and looking at where you're at now, that you had this small community, I would call it, in Ashburton to now living in one of the biggest cities in the world? Is it kind of a bit strange taking that look back?
It is a bit like that. I went home a couple of years ago when I was living in, I think I was here in New York, and I was hanging out with my family, and I went to see my dad at work. And I had this realization about kind of what a slow pace of life there is there, but also how valuable that is. Because I think when you're in your 20s and your early 30s, you're sort of chasing this adrenaline. You want to have fun in a big city. And it just really struck me. I thought, you know, this is a really good life here. And I haven't probably appreciated it enough in my 20s because, you know, people laugh about the small town where they come from. But I'm really actually quite proud to be from there. My mum and dad are still there. My sister's still there. My grandma's still there. I'm going home shortly. But I actually left Ashburton when I was about 13 because I went to boarding school. So I haven't lived there in a long time, but it definitely still feels like home, I have to say, yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, you're an alumni of Boys High, is that correct?
I am, yeah. So I went there when I was about 13 to the boarding house. And I have to say that was a real interesting experience. And I hated it for probably 6 to 10 months. I remember going home for the weekend and really not wanting to go back. Because when you're year 9 at a boarding house, you are quite literally at the bottom of the shit pile. And so you're doing all the dishes, you're doing all the odd jobs around the place. And it was a tough environment. I think if you're a 13, 14, 15-year-old and you're still trying to figure out who you are as a person, it's pretty tough to go home from school and you're sleeping next to sort of 4 other guys and you don't have any personal space. So that was a difficult journey for a while, but in the end, I'm glad that I did it.
Do you feel like you kind of became an adult immediately within that kind of period? It's kind of like you had to grow up a lot faster than probably a lot of other people because you do have those sort of adult experiences of having to take care of yourself, essentially.
I think so. And you also have to take care of other people because not everyone's made for it. And you often have people ask you now, you know, would you send your kids to boarding school? And I think it would really depend on the child because I've seen some kids that were really not fit for it because you know, in any school, there's bullying. It's a tough environment to grow up in. But yeah, you definitely have to grow up quick. And when you go flatting, this is interesting. I think you really benefit because you figure out, you've already known like how to live by yourself. And then you see your other friends who are 20, 21 still like really getting used to it. You had to do that 10 years ago. So, I think you get a lot out of it, but you, I guess you miss out on some things as well at the same time. And that's, you know, being around your family all the time.
But I'm guessing you get a greater appreciation of understanding the dynamics of the flat, basically. Like, who's the one who's not going to be doing the dishes at all, and you kind of being able to take the reins there and be like, I know you're pulling a fast one on me, mate. You can't do this. Is that sort of like the kind of like responsibilities or the kind of things you kind of picked up very quickly?
Yeah, I think so. You realize who's trying to get out of what at 13 years old. So by the time you're 20, 21 and Tonga Place and Riccarton, you really know what's going on. But yeah, we had a good time flatting as well. But yeah, I learned a lot from boarding school, I think.
And from the New York perspective as well, and I definitely have this being here in Buenos Aires, like the nostalgia for New Zealand. There are a couple of things that you often miss being over in New York. I know there's obviously Kiwi cafes and probably Kiwi restaurants that are in the central city, but what would you say is the one thing that you miss the most, apart from obviously the more relaxed lifestyle?
Mate, mince pies.
Straight up.
I know that's like such a generic answer, but I was on Facebook just doom scrolling the other day, and there was this pie from like Z Station or something. I'm like, oh my God, I just need to go home and like eat 3 of those. But the other thing I miss about home is just like fresh air. It's so simple, but fresh air and peace. I was walking, from lunch today, and there were just sirens everywhere. You know what New York and these cities are like. I'm just thinking, man, I just need a break from this place. But there's a lot you miss about New Zealand. But when you're there, you miss things about New York, or in your case, Argentina. So I'm looking forward to going home and just relaxing a little bit in a few months.
And I love the fact that we kind of touched on a little bit of the Christchurch Boys High experience, because the thing is, you seem to be really connected to some of your old Christchurch Boys High School friends. And it feels like to me that that's like lifelong friendships that have just continued despite where you've been in the world, which is for most people a strange thing to think about. Do you think that's an experience unique to New Zealand, or do you feel like that's something that's just unique to yourself?
That's a really good question. I think it might be a thing unique to New Zealand, although my wife would disagree with that. She says it's a bit like a cult. She might be right, Christchurch schools, but I'm very lucky. A lot of our friend group has stayed really close. And, I think one of the things that the reason for that is possibly, boarding school as well. I lived with these guys when we were still sort of finding who we are as people, and you stick together. I mean, one of my best mates from, boarding school, I was best man at his wedding in Virginia about 2 weeks ago. So I feel really lucky in that regard. And I've got a lot of friends in London who are still schoolmates. And yeah, it's a good observation, actually. I think when you have a friend group like that, you sometimes don't think about it as much and possibly don't appreciate it as much. But yeah, I am very lucky in that respect.
Would you say they've been some of your biggest champions, especially early on in your career? Because I only had to take a look at your Facebook page once to see some of them posting up videos of you being like, there he is, there's the man himself. Do you feel like they're still the ones that are screenshotting reports of you being out in the field, being like, there's the boy that we went to, like, obviously the boys high with. He was one that was washing dishes in year 9. Is that kind of the thing that you're still getting even now from your mates? A bit of flack, but also a bit of like, hell yeah, that's our man.
A little bit. I think the thing I get the most is probably friends going, I can't believe you are on the news and see how serious you are, because I know what you're really like in person. And I'm like, yeah, well, there's probably something to be said for that. But when I was probably in my early 20s, and, that was still my core friend group, when I started doing news reading at TV3, I was actually really self-conscious about hanging out with some of my school friends in big groups, because I was really conscious of that kind of tall poppy thing that we have back home. Not that my friends were critical or anything like that. I was just really worried about it. So I used to sort of be really quite nervous about hanging out with, old mates in big groups, because I might become the butt of the joke, and probably had nothing to worry about. But I was really self-conscious about that, given what I was doing for work was so public.
Oh, massively. And I think that must be confronting for anyone who's in like the public sphere, who's regularly making appearances on television, for example, that, yeah, you are going to be a common face around the place. And speaking of that experience as well, because you met your now wife at high school back in those days, does she still see the same Mitch whenever she sees you on television as well? Is it kind of still a bit of a weird experience for her, being like, my man is always going to be like in the public eye?
I think she has the same thing, as she knows what I'm like at home is possibly quite different to serious Mitch on the news. I think she finds that a little bit strange as well. Maybe her family did when I started becoming on TV more. But she's been very supportive throughout the whole process. And one of the good things about the media industry, and you've probably experienced this as well, is everyone is so close. So a lot of your colleagues, their partners and their families, and they know your families. So it's been quite cool, because she kind of knew everyone that she was seeing on the news, because we were all friends. It's such a close-knit industry, and I didn't realize that going into it, but I'm very grateful for it.
Because I think we had this kind of rose-tinted glasses look of it, like from broadcasting school, that everyone was going to be friends, but then it kind of ended up being the reality. Like, I don't know if you had this experience with the tutors, or like telling you, no, these are going to be some of the guys that you're never going to see again. They're going to be behind the scenes. That was totally not the experience I had. I ended up running into people so regularly that I was like, this is kind of like just being at high school again.
Yeah, you're right. Well, they say what a small industry it is, and you think, oh yeah, you always say that, but it really is, and I've come across friends that were in the TV stream at broadcasting school that I would then work with at TV3 or wherever else. And, I'm still very good friends with a couple of those people, that, you and I studied with, even lived with them for a while, and go to their weddings and things. So I think we've probably both been lucky in that respect, is that I think Kate Roger talked about this with you, and she said, you've found your tribe. And it was a bit like that at broadcasting school, right? All of a sudden you found people that had similar interests, that were into broadcasting. They didn't think you were a total nerd because you enjoyed watching the news. So yeah, I think we were lucky there.
But the interesting thing as well is that you had some pretty cool, like, early influences in terms of you actually moving into the sphere of going into news, which was your grandfather, who was a real news junkie. You even once said that he slept with one earphone in listening to radio sport. So how much of an influence did he have in terms of pushing you into journalism? Or no, it was just something that he kind of had in the background and you kind of took notice of?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of my childhood was spent at my grandparents just because we were so close. And so I would spend a lot of time there. My grandfather was always watching the news. It was always on. It was Sky News Australia. It was whatever he was watching. I would just sit and watch it too. And I think that's where my love for news started. And I would be into reading the newspaper, and then I could talk with Granddad about what was going on. And as you mentioned, he slept with one headphone. And I remember when the London bombings happened in 2007, and I was staying over, and I could hear the radio in their room. This was Radio Sport kind of was cancelled that morning, so it was broadcasting that. And so I went and listened to that with him, and that was sort of one of my earliest memories of news. And one of the sort of regrets, or the things that I'm always, quite sad about, is that he saw me sort of start in the industry, but when I started reading the news and doing 6 o'clock news stories, he'd already passed away. And so I think, he was one of my biggest champions in a way, but he never got to see, what I made of it. So that's a regret. But I think my grandma, his wife, has always been very proud. So I think he lives on through her in a way.
And also, in a way, by you still presenting the news, you're kind of embodying that as well. Like that whole thing of like, do you ever imagine the fact that he could potentially, do you ever imagine if he was still alive that he'd be listening right now? Is that kind of something that you take into sometimes your presenting roles, where you're like, I can imagine Granddad having the one earphone in, being like, oh yeah, Mitch is on the news, love it.
Yeah, I think he would be really proud. And I think, and you've probably had this where when you're learning to sort of broadcast, people say, just speak to one person. Think of one person that you're speaking of. When I started news reading, I would think of him, or I would think of my grandma. I haven't really told anyone that before, but I thought there was a good person to speak to. They're not going to judge you. They've never judged you, and they're always going to listen. And they're into news. And so that's how I thought about that. Yeah. And I've never really thought about that until now, but that's what I did when I was younger. Yeah.
And I think the thing that I always find funny is how people get into the industry. Now, you were originally going to study law in Dunedin, which is a polar opposite to many people. And funnily enough, I actually thought about doing the same thing at University of Canterbury. I don't know why law seems to be an immediate jump for anyone who's looking at getting into media, but you ended up changing direction, heading to broadcasting school. Now, you've said before that the reason that you avoided law was you just naturally felt like it wasn't going to be the right fit for you, and also probably couch burning wasn't on your kind of like CV at that time. So what is it that made you make that immediate change? Because it's a pretty drastic change to go from law to media.
Yeah, so I got into Unicol in Dunedin, which is no brag. I think everyone gets into Unicol. But I was sort of ready to go there, and I think in the back of my mind I thought, because I'd applied to broadcasting school, right? I think the reason I applied for law is because I thought, is broadcasting, is news, is it serious enough? You know what I mean? It's a tough industry. Only a small percentage of people make it, whatever that means. And it's going to be really tough. Is there a long-term career in this? But in the end, I think I was encouraged by my family and my friends. And I thought, well, this is what I think I'm good at and think what I could do. I'd rather have fun than slave away for 4 years and not really know where it's going. And I'm really glad that I did that and took a risk, because I think I could have probably gone to law school. Maybe it wouldn't have been that great for me. But I think a lot of young people have that same experience, is you just don't really want to make a decision for the rest of your life at 18, but you feel like you have to. I'm just lucky that, deep down, I probably knew that this is what I wanted to do.
Do you think that's also in the New Zealand mentality as well, as like you finish high school and you need to go straight into uni and that needs to be your life career? Do you think compared to maybe other countries where there's a bit more mobility in terms of you can shift careers later in your 30s or you can kind of pivot around, do you think that's kind of a New Zealand classic thing, like once you're in an industry you need to stay in it and have this like lifelong career? Or do you think that's maybe a bit of an over-exaggeration?
No, I think definitely there's that mentality in New Zealand that you go to school, you go to university, then you work. Whereas I think these days it's probably less necessary than it has been in the past. I think, New Zealand's got some great entrepreneurs, great innovators that have never been to university and do these great things. And so I think we probably need to encourage that a little bit more. Obviously, you need to go to uni if you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. But I think so many people are successful that don't need to do that. I'm a real advocate for people taking gap years after high school, because I think it's a good way to sort of see the world, find yourself, find out what you want to do, and probably save $15,000 on a student loan. I think a lot of parents have a apprehension for allowing their children to do gap years because they might not go back to studying. But I think, there's no better studying than studying the world.
Yeah, and I would also be concerned as well that they might become the guy at the campfire playing Wonderwall for the 30 million times. So I can understand that gap year concern. But yeah, I totally agree. It is kind of the classic experience, and the amount of times I hear from people that have had to, like, later in life end up changing careers and studying again because of the fact that they felt so pressured to go into something that just didn't work for them fundamentally. I love that you touched on that. And the funny thing is, some people probably would have got put off by this, and I don't know if this was you purely probably being stubborn or you being like, you know what, I'm still going to give it a crack anyway, was early in your kind of career, you were actually told that your voice wasn't suited to broadcasting, which I think can be a pretty cutting thing to be told to like a new broadcaster that's coming in. So how difficult was that for you to hear? But then how did you get over that criticism or that kind of comment and then be like, you know what, I'm still going to pursue this?
Yeah, that experience came about. I remember we started voice training in the first year of broadcasting school, and they handed out the forms that we submitted or we were marked on when we first applied to broadcasting school. And mine had in big words, "Do not recommend." It was based on their voice. And I said, "What's that mean?" And they said, "Oh, it doesn't mean much. It's all good." And then I realized what it meant and thought, shit, I've been told, all my friends at school, that I'd be good for this. Am I actually good for this? I don't know. And then, so it was a bit of a realization, man, maybe I need to get serious here. I don't know what went wrong. So what happened is that they said, well, you've got to go to voice training, with a lady called Diane in Riccarton. And I don't know if you had the same or that rings a bell.
Yep,
and so I went to Diane's house, and we used to do this role-playing exercise where we would do live crosses in her basement, and she'd give me a topic and I'd do a live cross, and she gave me all these vocal exercises and that sort of thing. And do you know, it was one of the best things that I did, and I'm glad that I had, my ego probably took a hit that needed to be taken. And for years, sorry, Diane, but I would photocopy those and give them to young journalists, the voice exercises she gave me, because it was so valuable. And so I'm not sure I would have had a good voice if I hadn't actually been told, you need to get better. And so, yeah, it was a bit of an ego hit, but I'm glad it happened.
Breaking it down even further, mate, I'd love to go into the structure of how they kind of reformed your voice, and what was it in particular that was pointed out in some of those sessions with Diane? Was it the fact that you had a bit of a southern drawl? I know, especially for people from the South Island, I get hit up about this all the time. Sometimes I have a tendency to roll words into one another, and especially when you start going through broadcasting school and other areas where you're going to be represented in the media, you need to kind of clean it up a little bit. What were some of the things that they pointed out to you?
I think the problem that I had was that I was trying too hard to be a rugby league commentator. And so I'd be reading the news like it was going to be Stacey Jones over the try line. And, that's obviously not going to work, but I needed someone to tell me that. And there was a period with Diane where we were doing this training, and I think she probably realized that maybe I didn't need to be there, or I wasn't as bad as perhaps my sample had been that I'd sent in. So once I dialed it back from being, Ray Warren commentating the State of Origin, it was probably better. It's been much better for my career. Although maybe I want to get into sports broadcasting one day, but I think it was too much rugby league.
It was like you had a character voice that you really wanted to maintain. They're like, maybe just be Mitch. Like, Mitch is good. Yeah.
Yeah, just dial it back about 200% and you'll be there.
And the crazy thing is, because you've worked across radio, TV, digital, like, you've had to be pretty adaptable. And probably when you first joined the newsroom, like in terms of like obviously straight after broadcasting school, did you feel like you were prepared for that? Because digital really started becoming a more like prominent part of the kind of media sphere. Or do you feel like it was kind of something that was introduced to you guys, but not really something that was focused on?
When I was at broadcasting school, it was something that was sort of not really touched on. And we talked about convergence all the time. You may remember, and it's like, oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. And of course it has happened now, but at the time you're just thinking, I'm going to be on the radio, I'm going to do TV broadcasting. And so you've just got to start learning it. I remember when I was at Radio Live, which was my first sort of serious job in news, and we started going, okay, we need to do social media, we need to do this, we need to do that, but no one really had a clear strategy on what that would be. And so sometimes it would just be filming sort of some videos somewhere, but the industry has changed so much in 10 years in that regard. And in fact, some ways I'm surprised that TV journalism and radio journalism as it was is still around. You know, I'm glad it is. I don't know how long it's going to be for, but you know, I hope now that digital journalism is the number one thing that they teach.
Stand by, and we're live. The Beyond Broadcast Podcast.
Something I'd love to touch on is the fact that throughout your journey, you've worked along some pretty incredible big hitters like Mike McRoberts, Patrick Gower, and Eric Young. Now, what is it like being in the presence of some of these guys that you probably grew up yourself watching? Is it kind of daunting in a way? And how was it when you managed to bridge that gap and be able to, like, I don't know, have a couple of bro handshakes with like Paddy Gower?
You know, when I first moved to Auckland, when I was working in radio, I was walking through Newmarket one day and Mike McRoberts walked past and I didn't know him. He didn't know me. And I was like, to Olivia, I thought, shit, that's Mike McRoberts. And she's like, grow up. You know, you look like a little excited schoolgirl. 2 years later, I was, you know, at the Commonwealth Games with Mike for News Hub. And so, yeah, it was pretty nerve wracking. I remember, Paddy Gower once, I was at Subway and he was there with his kids. And he forgot his credit card or something and I had to pay for his lunch and we just started working together. And that was probably a good way to get to know someone is you've just bought them lunch. So you're going to be their friend. But, you know, I have been lucky in that respect because all three of those people you named, Eric, Mike and Paddy, have all been just really, really kind. And, you know, I was thinking about Eric before. He's such a great newsreader. And when I started newsreading, I was very young. And so I was worried about, you know, how that would look, how I sounded, probably overconscious. I remember one Saturday night, before I think I was doing the 6 o'clock news, and Eric just rang me on his weekend just to talk through sort of technical aspects of newsreading, how, you know, breath work was going, warm-ups, how I was feeling. He didn't need to do that. And there are so many examples like that with him, like with Mike. You know, I remember in the Commonwealth Games with Mike in 2018, and he sat me down and we talked about, you know, the technical aspects of like this piece to camera we were doing on the Gold Coast and, you know, guys that didn't have to take the time out of their day, but chose to. And, you know, that's something that as a young broadcaster really sticks with you for a long time. I'm sure you've had similar experiences. There are so many kind people out there that want this industry to survive and want there to be more jobs in the future. So they're willing to, you know, put a hand out.
And from those mentors, what would you say is one of the quick tips that you always fall back on or you still acknowledge to this day that's in the back of your mind before you do a piece to cam?
That's a really good question. I think it goes back to maybe that rugby league commentary thing that the Mike talked to me a little bit about. And that is just, you know, look calm and be calm sort of thing. Don't overdo it. Sometimes when you think that you're speaking to, you know, tens of thousands of people, it's easy to sort of project as if you're talking to a big hall, but you're not. You're talking to that one person, that grandmother. And that was advice that Mike always gave me. And it took me quite a while to actually listen and understand what he was talking about. But I'm glad that he'd keep reinforcing that because I think now I understand it. And then it's advice that I can pass on to someone that's younger as well. So yeah, I think just rein it in a little bit.
Yeah, I think you might need to tell some of the Argentine football commentators the same thing because they're shouting as if they're shouting to the whole stadium. As much as I love it, don't get me wrong, I love the energy, but Jesus, it's a lot.
It's funny you say that because during the Football World Cup, the Telemundo Spanish broadcast in the US has been way more popular than everyone thought. And I had it on the other night and someone scored a goal and the commentator yelled, "Goal!" for like 2 minutes. And I'm sitting in the living room and going, is this a thing that they do? But obviously it is. And people love it.
Oh, mate, you're in for a world of like beautifulness when after this call and after this interview, mate, I'm going to be sending you a commentator from Argentina that sings a song for every player that scores a goal and he makes it up on the fly. It's incredible.
And people don't mind that.
Goal. No, they love it. He's insanely popular here. I don't like. Some people get annoyed with him. Other people absolutely love him. He's adored, like locally.
Can you imagine that in like an All Blacks game, like singing a song about Geordie Barrett when he scores a try?
Exactly, 100%, mate. It's always been something in the back of my mind. And your career has covered some of the most incredibly big, major news stories, which to you, I'm guessing, is another day in the office. But in terms of some of the things that like we can like kind of cover off, the Christchurch mosque attacks, the White Island eruption, COVID, the Tokyo Olympics, Queen Elizabeth II's death, which for a lot of people was the big kind of red flag. I remember this even when I was working on radio, that it was the thing that everyone was paranoid about. What's going to happen if she dies and you're on air? But how do you manage to kind of maintain yourself in those situations, especially when you have these big kind of events? How do you rein it in? And also, how do those assignments change you personally? Because you're reporting on some of the biggest events that people will remember for all of history.
I think that covering the mosque attacks in the studio when that happened in Christchurch sort of really made me grow up as a broadcaster. And it meant that when I got older and covered other big events, I wouldn't be as excitable or I wouldn't be as over the top because I'd dealt with something like that before. It taught me a lot about my career. And that was a really, I guess, unexpected moment. And it's one that I really, sometimes struggle to remember how it happened because it happened so fast. But I remember I was actually filling in that day when that happened, and there was a story that came across the news on stuff that something was going on in Christchurch. And in a newsroom, that sort of stuff happens all the time. There's always, a bomb threat or a threat around something. And so I went out for lunch. I went and got some sushi. And when I came back, there was just this absolute state of panic in the newsroom, just this state of panic. It's hard to describe. And I remember one of the producers, Kim, she said, "You need to go to the studio and you need to go now." I didn't really know what was going on, but I kind of got briefed when I got up there, and we were on air within probably 10 minutes. And this thing was still unfolding. And you have to remember here, I'm like 23, 24, barely had really read the news. All of a sudden, there's this kind of big story happening. But the good thing for me was that it was a small studio. There was really no one around. So I had no idea how many people were watching this, how had the country started paying attention to what's going on. And I remember probably about an hour into it that I was doing some sort of commentary of this video of this car that had been pulled over, and I knew where it was on Riccarton Road, and I could talk about where it was from Girls High and Boys High. And then we were in an ad break, and the auto cue flashed up with the next segment that I had to read, and it said that 26 people had died. And that was a significant jump from what I was talking about previously. And I remember just my stomach dropped, and I thought, this is a whole different thing than it was 10 minutes ago. And I just remember, get goosebumps thinking about it now. And yeah, we just broadcast it for the next couple of hours. And one of my good friends, a producer, who later my boss actually, Todd, was in the control room. And we did it there. And I remember going home that night because I had to come back for the late news. And all of a sudden I got in the door with some fast food, and I just felt this weight. I just started crying. And I feel almost bad saying that because, I mean, what did I go through, right? But at the same time, you're covering this sort of mental load that's just sort of washed off you. And I remember ringing one of my friends and just to talk about it because I just felt this just bizarre sort of weight wash off you, and then went back and did the late news as well. But it was a day that I definitely will never forget.
Because I think that's the thing. You can't prepare for those sorts of situations. So the tenseness that you felt wasn't something that you could immediately be prepared for, and certainly not with the fact that you said you were there covering a shift. It wasn't like you knew you were going to be put into such a situation. So I can understand why you're saying, obviously, that your reason for being upset doesn't compare, but in the same respect, it's a pretty crazy situation to be thrown into for someone so young now having to kind of take the reins of something that's so serious. And like, what was the general, like, I guess, reaction with everyone else there? Were they kind of supportive of you in that sense as well? Because they must have all equally known you were getting thrown into the mix pretty deeply.
Yeah, I remember coming out of the news studio at about 5:00. Colleagues of mine, Tom McRae and Melissa Chan Green, they took over into the evening. Mike McRoberts went to Christchurch, and I came out of the makeup room, and there was probably 15 people surrounding the TV watching the coverage. And then one of them turned around and saw that I was standing there watching it with them, and all of a sudden they're sort of saying, "Well done! Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!" And I just felt this, whoa! Because you didn't realize people were watching. I mean, obviously they were, but you're in this like little bubble. And then I went up to the newsroom and people were doing the same thing. And I thought, well, this is just bizarre because you've come out of this little box and the whole country's been watching. It was really crazy. And, you know, it's a weird thing to think about. I was thinking about this earlier because it was such a pivotal moment in my early career that was, you know, it's strange to say it was good for my career, but it was just such the most terrible thing that you would never wish would ever happen. And that's kind of this paradox in news, isn't it? That, you know, a strong day for a newsroom, a strong coverage of a terrible event that, you know, benefits your newsroom and your career. And, you know, you would never wish for that to happen, but it does feel, you know, rather uncomfortable.
But you've mentioned in various interviews, and I love the way that you put this, and I love this approach about you as well. And you mentioned that covering tragedy does require enormous amounts of empathy. And of course, it would be weird if you were someone that was reporting on such an event and not having that level of empathy or that connection with the people that are going through that. But how do you also avoid becoming what people sometimes describe as like the vulture journalist, which is probably like the journalist that everyone hates? I can speak from experience as well, having gone through the Christchurch earthquake, that I was in an area that was very heavily hit, and there were journalists all the time trying to come and interview my family, and it felt a bit kind of venomous. How do you avoid becoming that?
I think it's really tough because you know that you're not a vulture, right? But you can understand why they would think that. And so when you go to someone's house where there's been a car crash or something like that, I remember doing these stories in Auckland and throughout the North Island. I mean, human nature, you don't want to be doing death knocks or you don't want to be going to these people in their worst hour of the day. But that is sometimes part of the job. And one of the things that surprises me is that, you know, sometimes people actually do want to talk because they feel that no one's listening to them or they feel that they don't have a voice. And so I think sometimes the best thing you can do, someone told me, is to say, hey, look, there's going to be a story on this. We wanted to know that, you know, you have an opportunity to say whatever you like. We're happy to do that. No pressure, rather than trying to get in there. And it is difficult as a young reporter because you don't have the life experience or perhaps the empathy that life gives you to go up to people and talk like that. And it is difficult. I'm still conflicted in my mind whether people should be doing death knocks as journalists, because when you grow up and when you're at broadcasting school, they say, well, that's all part of it. That's all part of it. But the reality is that's not human nature. That doesn't feel comfortable and it doesn't feel good.
Do you think you've personally adjusted your own kind of style of work based on the experiences that you've had early on in your career? Because as you said, very early on, you were doing these death knocks. Do you feel like it's kind of changed you as a journalist and there's been like a maturing in terms of how you approach potential like door knocks or guests, among other things? Yeah,
I think I've become possibly more empathetic through some of those experiences. And I think, you know, there's also times when you'll say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not a 21-year-old journalist that a producer says you have to do this. And so you become older, you become more mature, and you can make those own decisions for yourself. But like I say, it is a really uncomfortable thing, like you've described.
And it's pretty crazy that this all happened, and then not long after, you then became News Hub's US correspondent, which is a pretty massive jump, a huge milestone. And what did that opportunity mean for you? And how did that approach come about? Was this something that you searched for, or was this something that they said, Mitch, we want to send you to the US? Like, how did that conversation even come about for you?
Well, even before that, I'd missed out on a couple of correspondent roles. And so one of the issues that I had, I suppose, was that I was news reading. I had a show that I anchored at 11:30 and I was off to read 4:30. So it was a pretty sweet gig, but I really wanted to be out in the field and I really wanted to be a correspondent. So I missed out on the Europe correspondent. I missed out on the Aussie correspondent. And I thought, what do I want to do here? Like, do I want to go do something else? Do I want to stay? And so this is a strange sort of story in that the day that I found out I hadn't got the Europe correspondent job after what was a really thorough interview process was the day that I found out I won the green card lottery to get a US visa the same morning. Like, it's bizarre. And so I didn't get that job and then didn't really think much of it and then thought, hold on, Donald Trump has just like come to power. We're covering it every day. I'm thinking of moving to the States. So what I decided, Olivia and I like, okay, yeah, we're going to go, but I didn't need to tell TV3 for a couple of months, right? And so I thought I'm going to come up with a really thorough pitch document where they can't say no to having a US correspondent. So what I'd do is I'd take my laptop home from work. I'd go through every news bulletin at 6 o'clock for a year, and it took ages, and I'd make graphs and data on how much US stories we'd cover, which networks we were using them from, all this sort of stuff. And then I told Paddy Gower. And so I had lunch with Paddy. I said, mate, this is what I've done. And what do you think? And, you know, Paddy's so positive and encouraging. He'd said, yeah, you got to do it. Okay, this is what you do. You send an email. They're going to freak out, and then you're going to go in and do this. And I'm like, okay, Paddy, whatever. So what I did is I had a meeting with my bosses who were fantastic, Sarah and Todd. And I said, hey, look, this is going to probably like shock you a little bit, but I'm leaving. I'm going to America, and I've also made this pitch document you might be interested in. And they were like super shocked. And they're like, okay. And then they said, so what about this pitch document? And I thought, oh, yeah, I didn't think you'd be interested in that, but I've got it. I was almost ready. And then they kept asking for it. And so I sent it to them, and they were like, oh, this is interesting. This is really interesting. We might not be able to get back to you before you leave, but we're hopeful we can do something. And so I had a few weeks off before I moved to the States. So I went to Bali, and this is another bizarre story. So I got Bali belly. You know, both ends sort of stuff, Jamie. Not nice.
No,
not
mate.
nice. Rough. And I get this, and I'm on this island drinking beers. I've got Bali belly, not a good combo. And it's Sarah Bristow in a meeting room in Auckland. And she goes, hey, we want to offer you this job. And I'm like elated, but I'm also like super sick. I've got my dream job. I don't know how the tax is going to work. I want to spew, but I'm also excited. And then the phone line cut out because the Wi-Fi was terrible at this resort. In the end, we connected and we sorted out the agreement, and it was announced and everything. And so that's how I got the job as the US correspondent. Not because I'd applied for it, but because I'd kind of, I guess, made the job up. And that taught me a lot at the same time as well. But that's how that came about. Yeah.
I love that you've just created your own opportunity, and I'm sure Paddy Gower was probably at one point thinking, this guy is absolutely mad. Like, what is he doing with this pitch document? It's absolutely mental. But I love the positivity that's attached with it. I think that's beautiful, and it's even better that it was a situation of you weren't just going to give up. You're just like, I know I want this correspondent thing. Like, yeah. I want to move in this. Is this also explaining why you have a relationship with Lloyd Burr as well, that you guys were quite close at one point?
Yeah, well, Lloyd and I
he was
worked
a UK
together.
correspondent. Yeah.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was a UK correspondent, but we started working together at Radio Live. And so Lloyd was, incredibly kind to me. Would always like give good, technical advice about, how to do voices and packages and that sort of thing. He also liked to drink, which I liked, as well. And so we got, it's the media industry. We got on really well. And, he's still a friend, and he's doing really, it's awesome seeing so many people doing great things in the New Zealand industry, which has had a difficult time in the last couple of years, right?
This podcast is powered by WIZZFX. We make brands sound sick. Music, radio, podcasts, sonic branding. If your audio needs to hit harder and stick longer, WIZZFX has you covered. Learn more at WIZZFX.com.
But moving to New York sounds incredibly exciting. I know for anyone who's met anyone who's traveled overseas, it can sound like, big lights, everything else in between. What was the biggest adjustment for you in the kind of the reality of actually setting yourself up with your wife down in New York? What was the biggest kind of adjustment for you? Was it the pace? Was it the cost of living? I know that might be a bit of a big one. What was the thing that you found when you were building that life there?
it wasn't having many friends, which was really, really difficult. You know, I'd come from a life in New Zealand where I lived with like 4 or 5 of my best mates. My other best mates I worked with, had lots of friends in Auckland, to a country where I had a couple of friends, but, you know, they work during the day when I'm sort of not yet. And, you know, it's really tough. And if you get here in the winter, it's pretty ruthless, much like London. And sort of you feel a little bit lost. And I remember thinking, man, this is a city of like 8 million people. How is it possible to be lonely? But I really was, because my wife Olivia, she would go off to work and I wouldn't be working till New Zealand time, so 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So what am I going to do all day? New York is fun, but it's also your home. You have like a normal life there. You're not going up the Empire State Building or the Brooklyn Bridge every day. So you've got to find something to do. So definitely the biggest adjustment was not having any friends. And I remember I struggled to sort of enjoy New York for a while. Of course, it's an amazing city to go on holiday, but as you know, it's very different living somewhere than being on holiday there. And I remember that Olivia just took to it like a duck to water. She just loved it instantly. And so that was nice for me, because I was worried that I dragged her on my adventure to America. But to see her thriving was really cool. So yeah, eventually I got the pace of life in New York, but it certainly took a while.
And how was it for you finding that eventual community for yourself? Because I'm imagining that you've built a pretty solid group of friends. How was it for you kind of being able to finally have like the community and say like, this is my new home now?
Yeah. I think sometimes I still find it difficult in the way that New York's a sort of a world where people are always coming and going. And so you might meet some friends and then they move elsewhere and you're still here. But I've got a good community of Kiwi mates that live here. There's some Aussie friends as well. And you know, my office now is at the UN. So there's people from all walks of life that you meet. The colleague I work with every day is from Russia. And so I've learned about, you know, so much about Moscow I would have never even thought to think. So, yeah, I think it took probably, you know, it almost took a year, man. I mean, a little bit ashamed to admit that, but it took almost a year to feel like, you know, this is my place now. Because when you've got such good connections back home, you're always kind of trying to get back there at some point.
Now, has New York lived up to the image that you expected before moving there, or the image that everyone else kind of expects of New York? Or do you think it's a little bit different when you're actually in the thick of it and maybe there is like a community or a small feel to New York depending on where you are? Because I certainly know for the sake of like, I don't know, having lived in London and Buenos Aires, you can have this little thing of like, if you're in your neighborhood, it can feel like a little community. Do you have that same feeling?
We do now. So when I moved here, I lived in the East Village of New York in Manhattan, which is like a busy place. It's a lot of like young students. I was like 28 and I felt so old. Everyone was young and hot. And here am I with my receding hairline, you know, tired all the time because I work New Zealand hours. But we moved to Brooklyn after a while here over the river. And it is, where we live, it's like a little community. So I work at the UN where it's chaos. And then I can go home to sort of where it's young families and things like that. And that's a really interesting point that you brought up, because it does mean that you can survive, really. You're not, you know, your cortisol levels aren't high all the time. But I think one of the things I love about New York is that, you know, it becomes your home, so it becomes normal. But when we have visitors, you know, all the time, and you might have this or had it in London where you see the magic of the city again through other people, and they get excited about, you know, Times Square, which I hate, but, you know, at night it can be pretty cool. I went up the Empire State Building with my cousins a few weeks ago for the first time. And so, you know, you get to see the magic of your city again through other people's eyes. And I think there's a lot of value in that. It reminds you that you're lucky to be here.
Now, one thing that I can definitely attest to is having worked for American companies and actually playing to my strength is the fact that sometimes the New Zealand accent can be the most disarming thing to have in your kind of tool belt. And would you say that has been something that's been an advantage for you overseas, particularly when you're having to interview sometimes people in situations where there needs to be a lot of trust involved? And one situation I can definitely talk to is the fact that there was an interview I saw you do, I think it was not long after Capitol Hill, where you were speaking with Trump supporters, which for the most part are very distrusting of the media and probably don't want to speak to any journalists. Do you feel like that's kind of played to your part a little bit?
100%. And I think New Zealanders have this reputation of, or New Zealand has this reputation of just being disarming. And I remember the first Donald Trump rally that I went to was in Pennsylvania somewhere, and it was at the Arnold Palmer International Airport, which is like this tiny little airport. Trump flew his plane in, and it was our first rally, right? So we didn't know what to expect. It was me and my colleague from Christchurch, JB, had flown over, and we're thinking, man, is they going to get the pitchforks out because we're the mainstream media? And as soon as you say, hey, we're from New Zealand and we want to have this discussion, relax. Oh, okay, that's interesting. And, some people will not like me saying this, but some of the people that I've interviewed in terms of the Trump supporters are the nicest people that I've ever interviewed. And I had that experience in Virginia, I think it was. This guy had built this church. Well, he actually bought the church and he'd set up the Trump store. And he put this thing across it and he sold metal testicles that you hang on the back of your bumper on your car. And he called them balls of steel. And I did a video on it for NewsHub social media, and I didn't think they'd put it up. I think it got 1 million views, which for NewsHub is massive. And they got this guy on the rock radio station. I passed on the details, and he was not politically correct. Like, they couldn't use half of the interview. But there were people in that store that were just overwhelmed that we were Kiwis and would come all that way, and they wanted to talk to us. And so regardless of, what their worldviews might be, I think there is a lot of American hospitality within that base or within that movement.
Yeah, because I've always been curious about this, because there is obviously the view of there is opinions that are on the very extreme sides in every regard, but would you say in most respects actually taking that time and being a little bit disarming allows them to kind of show a much more amicable and pleasant version of maybe what you don't see in the media, which is just the rage, the aggression and everything else because of the way that it's kind of portrayed?
That's a really good point. We've just been working on a story about this and the Football World Cup and what people's perceptions are before they come here and then after they've been here. And I think what we hear from people, and this has been my experience, is that all of America is not Donald Trump or it is not Kamala Harris. You've got millions of people that are normal people. They just have, political views that I might not agree with or you might not agree with. But I think there's such hospitality here. Americans sometimes have a poor reputation that is, can be quite unfair. And I think that's based on maybe, when you're reporting, you only show a 2-minute news story of the most sensational stuff. It's kind of natural. That's how it works. But that doesn't mean everyone's like that in this country, because they're not.
Massively. And I think it's something that I've really enjoyed about watching your piece to Cams is the fact that, you do have these kind of more personable interviews and chats with people that I feel is a lot more honest and true to form to what they're like. And another thing that I really love is the fact that you've learnt a lot culturally kind of in America as well. You spoke in an interview about the fact that you found that you ended up advocating for yourself more in America. And I think that's something that the US has done a really good job of in terms of I've worked for companies in the US as well, and I feel like people are their biggest champions. They're their own champions. They don't expect other people to push them forward. And do you feel like that's kind of something that you've taken on yourself? Because you mentioned tall poppy syndrome. That's a big thing. We always try to be humble all the time. We never ask for too much. We're never give me more, sir. If anything, we just wait for the opportunities to kind of come to us and then hope that they come soon. Do you think that's kind of allowed you to chase bigger opportunities, having that cultural adjustment?
Yeah, I think perhaps it has. It's interesting. I mean, that is one of the biggest cultural changes coming to the United States, is that the tall poppy syndrome isn't really a thing. I mean, people's success is celebrated when they're young and they're doing well. And I think perhaps, I talk with my wife about this, and, we'll say to each other, well, you just need to be more American, or you just need to be more American about this. And it's kind of true. I mean, it's one of the great things I love about American culture is, even though they, blow their own trumpets a little bit, why not? it works for them. And I think it's a great country where people are doing great things, on the most part. But there's this real sense of pushing yourself and backing yourself and having self-confidence that perhaps we don't have as much of at home.
Massively. And shifting the conversation to something that I did mention earlier, which was, it must have been a massive shock for you, especially when you were based over in the US, the closure of NewsHub, which was news to everyone, basically, that was going to be occurring. And as you said, there was virtually no warning. There was nothing for you to be able to kind of have something ready at the go. What was that period like for you? And from your perspective, what was going through your mind when you heard the announcement that NewsHub was going to be shutting its doors?
Probably two things, I think. One was we always thought this might happen, but we didn't think it was going to happen now. And the other thing was, well, what does this mean for me? Because I came over here to do this. I came over here to cover the 2024 election, and I've only got halfway through. So that was really difficult. But at the same time, you realize you've also got colleagues in New Zealand who are much older that are going to find it much more difficult to, gain meaningful employment, in an industry with less jobs. So it was a difficult time. So I was, actually that morning that it was announced, I had an interview with TV Guide. It was, just about being over here. And one of my good friends who worked for PR at TV3, she texted me and said, "Hey, this has been cancelled. Can't really say why, but, we'll revisit this later on." I thought, this is really weird because we talked about it last night. And then, as the day goes on, things started to filter through, and then there's a meeting, and then it's revealed, and you feel a long way from your friends. And so I worked with a camera operator over here, Dan Pannett, fantastic guy, one of my best mates. And we were doing work for TV3. So we just went to the pub and started drinking beers. I mean, what else do you do? Because there's no one else here in New York that, gives a shit. So you might as well hang out with your best mate you're doing this with. And I was really gutted because working for TV3 in New Zealand meant that my family could see what I did. My friends could see the work that I was doing. It felt really meaningful to be out covering America for back home. And so, it was really disappointing, really sort of heartbreaking in a way, because a lot of work had gone into planning for the election period. We were about to book hotels, do all the stuff, and then, but that's the nature of what we do, I suppose.
But I love the fact that you're able to adjust and kind of work your way around being able to find new opportunities where you can. And going into kind of another area, which I find really interesting, and it kind of leans back into this whole idea of how you can be disarming, among other things, in terms of the way that you approach your interviewees and the way that you kind of bring yourself to be able to create that space to make people feel comfortable. And one thing I really want to touch on is the fact that you argue that news organizations need to spend less time defending themselves and more time listening to criticism, which I think is a really interesting take for someone who's a journalist, because more often than not, it's kind of we're doing the right thing. We shouldn't really look at the feedback too much. There can be furore on social media and negative comments, but you're saying maybe sometimes we should look at that and take a look at that. Why is it that you feel like there does need to be a little bit more reflection in journalism?
Yeah, and I think I acknowledge that that's probably an unpopular opinion among a lot of my friends and colleagues, but I feel really deeply about that. And I think it's for two reasons. One is that I come from a small town, a small rural place in New Zealand, and I can see how people think differently about the media and about trust. And so, I'll go home and hear different things about, broadcasting. And so I come from that world. And the other thing is that we just have to look at the statistics. I was looking at this before we spoke. There were, AUT do that trust study of media every year. And they did the most recent one, and they said, well, it's great news because it's gone from 32% trust to 37% trust. On what planet is 37% trust good? I mean, that's not good. And so I think, and I can just hear people rolling their eyes at this, right? But I really think that we need to say, okay, what can we do better, rather than saying, oh, well, we're right and they're wrong because we're the news. I mean, it doesn't work like that. If you don't have trust, what do you have? And, I think TVNZ are doing a better job of it now. I think they commission reports into trust regularly. Friends who work there say that, but it's really important to me. I think we just can't, fob off people as being crazies or right wing or left wing. People should have opinions and be allowed to have them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think being able to be critical of yourself really just leads to improvement. Much like what you said, 37% shouldn't really be seen as a positive thing. There can always be improvement that can be made, and any improvement is obviously going to make the product itself better, especially for you guys. And I want to move into another area, which is, obviously, like you said, media can be a bit of a fickle thing. We all have this sort of well, when's the next paycheck going to come? Is this going to be still around? And in that sense, it can be a bit tolling on the personal relationship. And we touched earlier on the fact that Olivia kind of took to New York very simply, just loved it, kind of went in. And I guess in that respect, you're building this life in New York. How important has it been to have that support from her? Because I imagine she had her job, she was all good going to the office. How was it important? Like, was it really important for you to have that kind of like support from her from the very get-go when you did move over?
Yeah, especially when I didn't have many friends, she would get home and I'd just chat her ear off, or, be messaging her throughout the day about absolutely nothing because I had no one to speak to. But I think one of the differences between her and I think this works well, is that she's like really straight up. Like she'll call out bullshit really easy. And so she could be like, well, you need to go out there and you need to meet people and you need to be doing this. And sometimes you need to hear things like that. And I think that's why we work well, is because she says it like it is. And I think, our friends and family notice that as well. And that's one of the great things about her. And we were also lucky when I moved here. I had a friend from TV3 and we basically slept on his floor for a month, and 2 weeks into it, the Queen died, as you mentioned, and me and Simon went off to Scotland, to Balmoral, and Olivia was left with Simon's wife, and we were having a great time, and she's still like adjusting to life in New York, because she's, she can do that. She's lived overseas before. She's been really good. So yeah. She's great.
It sounds like you guys are meant to be together in that sense, like a yin and yang, and I love that, man, because I think that's so important when you are going through that kind of like big life change of moving somewhere new. And on top of that, yeah, like you said, the social pressures of like having to make a new community, make new friends, and also just kind of get your head around the fact that you're in a pretty fucking crazy place like New York. So yeah, bro, I think that's really beautiful. And yeah, I think another thing to kind of touch on is the fact that you are in this pretty interesting political and social sphere in the US. And I'm assuming there's probably some things that are like main news topics in the US that perhaps New Zealand never covers. What do you think are some of the like areas that you've found that have often been reported in the US news that often New Zealand doesn't touch at all?
I think with, Trump stuff sometimes, and I understand why this is, because as a journalist, sometimes you get 2 minutes to do a TV package and it's got to be about the most interesting thing. So you are going to miss stuff. And I think some people say to me, well, a lot of people say, why do these people like Donald Trump? Or what are these stories that, we just don't get it. Why do people like him? And so there are some things that maybe you don't hear as much about overseas, like, a lot of Americans got significant tax returns this year. And that's not a very sexy story to tell overseas, but it's also one of these reasons that people might try and vote for Donald Trump. So there are like a couple of little things like that, but I can understand why it is, because he'll make an announcement. It could be seen as positive, and then he'll say something absolutely ridiculous that becomes the headline, understandably. So I think there are things like that as well. But, working in the US is just a non-stop, it's just constant news. I remember I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. It's like you take a Saturday and Sunday off. By Monday, you're significantly behind whatever's happened over the weekend, and you'll spend an hour trying to like read in over what Trump said over the weekend. But if you follow it every day, that's not good for your, your mental health, because you're going to be exhausted. Reminds me a bit of working in New Zealand, where it was just like so demanding. But yeah, that's what I would say. It's a demanding place to work, and I can see why a lot of journos end up leaving after they've covered the White House.
And in terms of, you mentioned demanding, what keeps you sane in these times where you have a pretty fast news cycle? What are the things that keeps you kind of grounded and able to like kind of continue on for another day?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've just started trying to get more into like reading for two reasons. One is to relax, and the other reason is that I feel like I'm becoming too reliant on like AI. And so I'm really worried that my like brain capacity is going to be like slightly diminished. So I've started reading again. I mean, does that sound terrible? I'm sure I'm not the only one that's doing that, but, just the normal things. And I really like to get out of New York City as much as I can. So Olivia and I like to go upstate when we can, or even if I go to another state for work, that feels somewhat relaxed. Like I might be still working, but I'm out of this hustle and bustle. I mean, America is such an amazing place. And, I've just remembered one of these, how I was talking to you earlier about hospitality.
Yeah.
I just remember the story, down in Tennessee, last year. I mean, the news story is very sad. A bomb factory exploded, right? And so like a heap of people had died at this bomb factory, and we went down there, but all the cars in Nashville had been hired for the weekend. So there were no cars. And so we went to this hotel an hour and a half out of Nashville, random, in an Uber. But how are you going to do a news story in like a regional place without a car? So I made friends with the hotel workers, and I paid one of the cleaners $100 to use her Prado for the day, and we went around doing a story, and they were just the nicest people. And I'm just trying to underscore sort of how great so many people are in different parts of the country. America is not just Washington or New York or Los Angeles. It's also, Tennessee, it's Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I think I'm just trying to get across that, America can have a really bad reputation, but it also can be just this amazing place.
And you feel like the longer that you spend there, the more you discover about it and the more that you like about it. Is it kind of one of these things that it grows on you the longer that you're there?
I think so. But there are times where you think, man, maybe it's time to get out of here. When you see some of the crime or the issues on the New York subway, but then you'll go to a place like, Charleston, South Carolina or something, and you'll be like, man, I love it here. I just love it here. And so I think for us now, it's deciding how long we are in America, whether this is our home now or New Zealand. New Zealand's always your home, but when do you go back? And I'm sure you and many Kiwis, Europe, UK, South America, always think the same thing. There's this kind of tether always pulling you back. Sometimes it's stronger than others, but it's always there.
Oh, mate, I couldn't agree more. It's a constant thing of weighing up what is keeping you in the country and what's going to make you go back 100%. And For you now, Mitch, how do you feel now? Like where you're at now in terms of your career, because you've had so many changes. Where are you feeling at this current point? Like, are you feeling like there's going to be something next in terms of you're going to move somewhere else? Or do you feel like the US is going to be your last hurrah before you end up heading home?
Yeah, I can't see myself living in Europe or anywhere else. I think, I love living in the States, and journalism-wise, it's a great place to be. There's always something happening, especially with Donald Trump in power. So there's always news. And, every now and then I think you need a big story or an assignment somewhere to remind you of why you love it, because it's not a glamorous job on the whole. You get to travel, but sometimes it's, very exhausting. Yeah. So I'm not sure. We'll see what the future holds. But at the moment, I'm enjoying feeling like I'm in the center of where everything's happening news wise. We've just got the World Cup. The Olympics are here in a couple of years. So I think it's a hot place to be if you're a news reporter.
Massively. And in terms of, I guess, this is the final question. Now, when people think about Mitch McCann, and like I said, as soon as I mentioned your name to my mum, she was like, you're speaking with Mitch? I remember Mitch. No, he's great. He's fantastic on the telly. When people think about you in the future, Mitch, what do you want them to think about you and your career in terms of your work in reporting, your work as an anchor? What do you want them to remember about you?
I think I would want them to think that I was an empathetic person. And the reason for that is that I think that's something that has come over time. It's probably not something I had when I was 19 or 20 and quite gung-ho and just wanted to get out there and tell stories. And so I'd want to be, remembered as someone that had, real compassion for the people that shared their stories. And I probably haven't always got it right. In fact, I definitely haven't. But I think on the whole, it's always a work in progress. And the reporters that I admire the most, they're people like, in particular, Melissa Chan Green, I always think of, or, Hillary Barry, one of my colleagues, Alice Wilkins, who I used to work with. I've just got this natural empathy that I've always admired. So I definitely think that's something I would like people to, consider me to have.
For listening to this episode of the Beyond Broadcast podcast, proudly sponsored by WIZZFX, specialists in audio branding. If you enjoyed the show, give a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform. You can connect with the show on Instagram at Beyond Broadcast Pod and subscribe for updates on new episodes.